Hello and welcome. I am Pranay Upadhyay and you are watching World Today. Tensions are rising between Washington DC and New Delhi over trade and foreign policy decisions, particularly India's stance on energy imports from Russia despite Western sanctions. India's Ministry of External Affairs issued a hard-hitting 6-point statement denouncing President Donald Trump's tariff and penalty threats, which were triggered by India's continued purchase of Russian oil. Hours later, the American leader has once again escalated trade tensions. In a fresh statement, President Donald Trump has criticized India for continuing oil imports from Russia and warned of imposing additional tariffs within the next 24 hours. Here is a report.
Hours after India issued a firm response to US President Donald Trump's latest tariff warning, the American leader has once again escalated trade tensions. In a fresh statement, Trump criticized India for continuing oil imports from Russia and warned of imposing additional tariffs within the next 24 hours. In a media interview, President Trump described India as not a good trading partner and signaled that punitive measures could follow soon. He said, and I quote, "India has not been a good trading partner because they do a lot of business with us, but we don't do business with them. So we settled on 25%. But I think I'm going to raise that very substantially over the next 24 hours. Because they are buying Russian oil. They are fueling the war machine." The height of hypocrisy lies in the fact that while India is only the second largest importer of Russian oil behind China, which remains Russia's top buyer, Trump continues to single out and threaten India with tariffs over its energy dealings. Meanwhile, his stance on China, despite its far deeper economic ties with Russia, remains notably soft. While Trump criticized India in his interview, he praised the US-China relationship, stating, "We have a very good relationship. I'll end up having a meeting before the end of the year, most likely, if we make a deal. But we are getting very close to a deal. We are getting along with China very well. China is very reliant on the United States." The comments came amid rising strains between Washington and New Delhi over trade and foreign policy decisions, particularly India's stance on energy imports despite Western sanctions on Russia. India's Ministry of External Affairs issued a hard-hitting 6-point statement denouncing President Trump's tariff threats, which were triggered by India's continued purchase of Russian oil. The statement not only exposed the blatant double standards of the West, but also sent a powerful message that India will pursue an independent foreign policy rooted in national interest, unfazed by pressure or threats. The MEA's 6-point reaction came hours after Trump took to his social media and accused India of buying massive amount of Russian oil and selling it in the open market for big profits, and promised to impose fresh tariffs on New Delhi. The MEA statement directly called out on Western hypocrisy. Its 6th point, which referred to India as a major economy, was a sharp counter to Trump's earlier dismissal of India's economic stature, where he referred to Indian economy as dead. The European Union too was not spared. The MEA's statement made clear reference to the EU's ongoing trade with Russia, even in non-essential goods and services. This came in response to recent comments by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who in a threatening tone warned India of 100% secondary sanctions if it continued its energy trade with Russia.
If you are the president of China, or the Prime Minister of India, or the president of Brazil, and you are still trading with the Russians and getting the oil and the gas in, and you sometimes even resell it for a higher price, know that if this guy in Moscow doesn't get serious about peace talks, I will slam secondary sanctions on you of 100%.
Meanwhile, India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar too reiterated the need for a fair and multipolar global order.
We live in complicated and uncertain times. Our collective desire is to see a fair and representative global order, not one dominated by a few. That quest is often articulated as political or economic rebalance.
India's friend and ally Russia has voiced strong support for New Delhi. The Kremlin has criticized Washington's threat of additional tariffs, calling it an example of illegal trade pressure.
We hear many statements that are in fact threats, attempts to force countries to cut trade relations with Russia. We do not consider such statements to be legal. We believe that sovereign countries should have and do have the right to choose their own trading partners, partners for trade and economic cooperation, and to choose for themselves the forms of trade and economic cooperation that are in the interests of a particular country.
With India's firm message to Washington and President Trump's 24-hour ultimatum deadline, all eyes are now on how the two strategic partners navigate this diplomatic and economic standoff and whether their decades-old friendship can withstand the strain. With Neha Kumari, Bureau Report, India Today.
For many decades, India-US relationship enjoyed a bipartisan support both in Washington, D.C. and in New Delhi. But which way President Donald Trump is trying to steer this relationship? This remains a big question. To discuss it in further, I am being joined by Ambassador Atul Keshav, who has served as a US diplomat and president of the US-India Business Council. Welcome to World Today, sir. My first question to you, Ambassador Keshav, that you must have seen the recent remarks by President Donald Trump threatening substantial increase in tariff on India with penalties for its Russian oil purchase. Where do you see the India-US strategic partnership going, and how do you see as a person who have spent like so many years in building this partnership?
Well, I wouldn't be truthful if I didn't say that I were a little bit alarmed at where things are right now between Delhi and Washington. You know, in truth, the partnership between the United States and India that has been forged over the past 25 years of bipartisan consensus in both capitals has brought enormous benefit, mutual benefit to the people of both countries. And I think our elected leaders ought to be very proud of what we have accomplished together. So, you know, the business community, I think, sees great value in our shared strategic and technological and economic partnership. We believe that we have complementary economies that are, and these are powerful arguments for continuing the path of convergence. I feel personally that it's time to redouble our efforts. It's not time to pull apart. And frankly, speaking on behalf of business stands ready to help.
Absolutely, Ambassador Keshav. That's why many people are also surprised in India. But you must have seen the MEA statement wherein Indian government has called out the United States as well as the EU for their own trade dealings with Russia, pointing out the double standards. Do you think this would help President Donald Trump to look at reason over rhetoric in India-US relation? And would you call it a fair pushback by India to maintain a strategic autonomy?
Well, first of all, I think that friends, when they have issues with one another, ought to speak privately. And so while there have been a lot of press statements and tweets that have been rattling around, you know, my sense from a career in diplomacy is that this is when friends pick up the phone and talk to one another, and they work through whatever differences of opinion they might have. You know, think about how this moment between Delhi and Washington is viewed among all of our like-minded friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific. You know, the president of the Philippines is in Delhi right now. How would the Philippines feel about this tension between two pillars of the Quad, Delhi and Washington? I worked on the Quad for a very long time. I think it's important. It sends an important strategic signal about the congruence of the great democracies in helping solve the strategic and economic challenges of the Indo-Pacific. You know, one thing I worry about is that this moment of public exchanges of statements is really only giving comfort and happiness to Beijing and Rawalpindi. And we ought to think about that. We ought to contemplate how we can come up with a productive way forward that involves making really good agreements between Delhi and Washington. And think about all of the work that we have done in the past. You know, the nuclear deal, the military agreements, the intelligence and counterterrorism agreements, the law enforcement, outer space. Think about the Nisar launch and Axiom and so much else that we've done, the MOM mission, Chandrayaan. All of this is worth preserving. All of this is important, and it needs to be complemented by real, meaningful economic agreements. The business community is fully in favor of meaningful trade agreements between the US and India. Let's get that done.
Absolutely, Ambassador Keshav. You mentioned rightly about China, but President Donald Trump's tone on China seems to be softer, hinting at a potential deal and a very good relationship. Why do you think he is taking a harder line on India and a key strategic partner as compared to China on the Russian oil issue?
Well, I can't speak for the president, but I think there is clearly a shift that has happened in American politics. You can see that from the election. You can see how different Trump 2 is from Trump 1, and I served the US government in Trump 1. You can see how our tone and approach is different. I think there's a very clear sense that the US needs to transform its economic posture with regard to many countries around the world. The president, the secretary of Treasury, and others have been very clear about this. And also there's a recognition that America risks falling behind in some critical areas where we have to be a bit more supple and reactive in ways that try to enhance our competitiveness. So the politics in my country have changed. The politics in Washington are very different. The economic assumptions are very different. The way things are done in Washington and between Washington and its friends around the world has also changed. And I think this is where a really smart country like India that has a very great deal of knowledge and exposure to Washington and to America, also needs to pivot a little bit and adjust its posture in how it deals with Washington.
Absolutely, Ambassador Keshav. A lot of things have changed in Washington, D.C. But with President Donald Trump's deadline for a Ukraine-Russia peace deal looming and his tariff announcement going into effect from August 7th, what concrete steps can India and United States take to strengthen their partnership and avoid a diplomatic fallout?
Well, so we've been talking about this, informally for months. And I think that the two governments, first of all, had a very useful trade negotiation. India was a first mover in all of these trade negotiations. The Prime Minister had an excellent visit to Washington in February. There was a wonderful joint statement that came out of that. But we need to go back to where that was. We need to go back to that spirit of technological, economic, and strategic collaboration between the United States and India. It's too important to squander. 25 years of effort have gone into this collaboration up to this point. It will only benefit our shared enemies if we now have a sharp difference of opinion that causes us to draw apart. So you mentioned Europe and Russia and China. My sense of this is if the two greatest democracies on earth do not set the standards for trade and technology, supply chains, strategic issues over the course of this century, then our enemies will. And it will be to our shared disadvantage and to our shared detriment. So look, the Europeans, I can't speak for them, but they have given a lot of armaments to Ukraine. They've given a lot of money to Ukraine, a lot of political solidarity to Ukraine, even as they've tried to wean themselves off of Russian oil because of the strategic entanglement that it creates with Russia and the strategic compromise that it creates with Russia. We have talked about how there's a possibility for India to buy more defense articles and agricultural goods and energy from the United States. I think the energy in particular would create a very great degree of economic collaboration between the US and India. So there's a lot that could be done to kind of reset things, bring us back to par, and put us back on the track that we've been working on for the past 25 years. I think it's very urgent that we do so.
I absolutely agree with you, Ambassador Keshav, that a lot of things can be done in India-US partnership, India-US relationship, but not with the tone and tenor of President Donald Trump. Thank you very much for joining with us and sharing your perspective, Ambassador Keshav. Thank you very much. And let's move on to another story, because President Donald Trump is not only hitting out at India, but he is also engaging with other world leaders as well. After a fierce exchange of words between former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev and US President Donald Trump over social media, Russian leader Dmitry Medvedev blamed NATO countries for abandoning a moratorium on short and medium-range nuclear missiles and said Moscow would take further steps in response. Let's have a look at this report.
Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev blamed NATO countries for the abandonment of a moratorium on short and medium-range nuclear missiles and said Moscow would take further steps in response. Medvedev, who has been engaging in a war of words on social media with US President Donald Trump, commented after Russia's foreign ministry said Moscow no longer considered itself bound by the moratorium on the deployment of short and medium-range nuclear missiles.
В России больше нет никаких ограничений.
Russia no longer has any restrictions in this regard. Russia no longer considers itself limited by anything. That means Russia feels entitled to take appropriate action and make appropriate steps if needed.
Соответствующие меры. Делать соответствующие шаги.
Medvedev, who now serves as deputy head of Russia's powerful Security Council, did not elaborate. The US had withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, citing Russian non-compliance. Russia has since said it would not deploy such weapons, provided that Washington did not do so. Medvedev, seen initially in the West as a potential moderate and reformer, has become one of the most hawkish senior officials on foreign policy in Moscow. Trump said he had ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be moved to the appropriate regions in response to remarks from Medvedev about the risk of war between the nuclear-armed adversaries. The INF Treaty, signed in 1987 by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and US President Ronald Reagan, eliminated an entire class of weapons, ground-launched missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. Bureau Report, India Today.
And now let's talk about an old friend of President Donald Trump with whom he had a fallout. Yes, we are talking about Elon Musk. Tesla board has decided to give its CEO Elon Musk another huge payday. The company's latest CEO pay package, worth about $29 billion, comes several months after the Delaware court rejected for a second time Musk's 2018 Performance Award following a shareholder lawsuit. Musk is currently appealing the order. In a letter to shareholders, Tesla said that Musk has not received a meaningful compensation for 8 years and that its legal efforts continue to reinstate the 2018 pay package, adding that there is no clear timeline for resolution. And now let's move on to another big story. As the humanitarian crisis worsens in Israel-Gaza conflict, voices are growing louder for the release of remaining hostages held captive by Hamas. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is planning to expand the Israeli military operation and fully occupy entire Gaza Strip.
As clamor grows for an immediate end to the war in Gaza and the return of the remaining hostages, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is planning to fully occupy the Gaza Strip. The decision will be taken in his war cabinet.
These achievements, of course, are behind us, but it is still necessary to complete the defeat of the enemy in Gaza, to release all our hostages, and to ensure that Gaza will no longer pose a threat to Israel. We are not giving up on any of these tasks. We will do it together through the great sacrifice of our male and female fighters.
The plan aims to expand military operations across the enclave. There is intense pressure on Netanyahu to allow humanitarian aid into the enclave, preventing deaths from malnutrition. The opposition has attacked the government for its inaction and inability to free the hostages.
This government is against the Israeli interest of freeing the hostages, finishing the war, and starting the recovery process, which is so badly needed for the Israeli society and for the people in Israel.
Earlier, Hamas had released video of Israeli hostage Aviatar David. The video shows David appearing skeletally thin. Another video of Israeli hostage Rom Braslavsky was also released by Hamas, which showed him saying he was suffering from physical pain and in severe mental distress. Referring to the video's release, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar called the international community to raise their concerns on the hostage crisis.
This past weekend, Hamas and Islamic Jihad cruelly released horrifying videos of our hostages, Aviatar David and Rom Braslavsky. The world witnessed their terrible condition, starved, tortured. Eviatar was forced to dig his own grave. The world saw the thick arm of the well-fed terrorist next to the starved and tortured Eviatar.
Days ago, US Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, visited Gaza aid site. He also met families of the Israeli hostages. Hamas called the visit of Witkoff to the aid center as a pre-scripted theatrical performance designed to mislead public opinion, whitewash the occupation's image and provide political cover for its starvation policies and systematic killing of innocent children and civilians in Gaza. Hamas also said it will not disarm until the establishment of the State of Palestine. Large crowds of Palestinians gathered around trucks in Gaza's Khan Yunis, with people grabbing bags and boxes of aid supplies. Palestinian and UN officials say Gaza needs around 600 aid trucks to enter per day to meet the humanitarian requirements, the number Israel used to allow into Gaza before the war. According to an Israeli military agency which coordinates aid, said Israel will allow gradual and controlled entry of goods to Gaza through local merchants. Israel had announced last week to let more aid reach Gaza, including pausing fighting for part of the day in some areas, approving airdrops and announcing protected routes for aid convoys. With Mahashweta Lala, Bureau Report, India Today.
Brazil's Supreme Court issued a house arrest order for former President Jair Bolsonaro, who is staging trial against allegedly plotting a coup in a move that could escalate tensions with the administration of US President Donald Trump. Justice Alexandre de Moraes, in his decision, stated that the right-wing firebrand did not comply with the judicial restraining order imposed on him last month. Moraes also banned Bolsonaro from receiving visits, with exceptions from lawyers and people authorized by the court, and use of cell phones either directly or through third parties. The restrictions on Bolsonaro were imposed over allegations that he courted the interference of President Donald Trump, who recently tied steep new tariffs on Brazilian goods, what he called a witch hunt against Bolsonaro. The former Brazilian leader is facing charges that he conspired with dozens of his allies and his supporters to overturn the 2022 electoral loss. Moving on to Pakistan. Police fired tear gas to disperse the supporters of Pakistan's main opposition party Tehreek-e-Insaf in Karachi on the second anniversary of the jailing of party leader and former Prime Minister Imran Khan. Police in Pakistan arrested more than 150 activists of the main opposition party holding protests across the country. Security officials and police have informed media that these arrests have been made due to security situation. Islamabad and nearby Rawalpindi remained quiet, with heavy police deployment on main roads. Videos shared by the PTI's media wing showed demonstrations in various locations. Khan was arrested in May 2023, which sparked protests against the military nationwide, leading to a crackdown on the party. Imran Khan denies any wrongdoing and has dismissed the dozens of cases against him as politically motivated and ranging from terrorism to disclosure of official secrets. He was convicted in January in a corruption case but was acquitted of other charges which was received on suspended sentence. Hundreds of Khan's party members, including several parliamentarians, were convicted late last month on charges related to 2023 protests against his arrest. Imran Khan's party emerged as the single biggest party in 2024 parliamentary elections, and it says that the vote rigging robbed it of more seats. And that's all we have in today's edition of World Today. For more international stories, do log on to India Today Global on YouTube. Take care and good night.